As you heard there, lots more fallout from David Johnston's decision not to call for a public inquiry into foreign interference. Today, a political battle happening that's primarily focused on the documents that the former Governor General says cemented his decision. Both Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre and Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet say they will not look at those top-secret documents, with the latter calling it a trap. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says he'll get the clearance required to see the documents. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, as you heard, is accusing Poilievre and Blanchet of choosing ignorance. Let's break this all down with former Canadian Ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, and former Conservative Foreign Affairs Minister, Peter MacKay. Hello to both of you. Thank you so much for making the time for this discussion this evening. Mr. Saint-Jacques, I'll start with you. You were one of the first people out of the gate as soon as these headlines surfaced to call for an inquiry. Are you surprised ultimately at the decision Mr. Johnston came to? And are you surprised at all to the political blowback to it today?
Well, you know, it's a very interesting report, and I must say that I have a lot of time for Mr. Johnston. He is a serious person, and it's clear that when you read the report, he has consulted a lot of people, read a lot of documents, and I think, in fact, there are both positive and less positive elements in his report. The positive is he confirms that we are faced with a very serious Chinese interference problem, plus a serious accountability problem in the government, the way that sensitive information is managed. And also, I think this has been missed to some point, he says, look, this is a matter of urgency. We need to move ahead, and we should not waste more time with the public inquiry. And that's a direct message to Prime Minister Trudeau that he has all the information he needs to take much stronger action. Among the weak points, I would say that, and you know, I've been involved in with the handling of sensitive material. I don't buy the argument that Minister Blair, because his office didn't have the equipment required to receive top-secret document, that he was not aware, for instance, of what the Chinese were trying to do to Mr. Chong. Well, there is a system for distributing material to people who need to see such information by special messenger. And, you know, it just makes no sense that the Minister of Public Security would not have been aware of this. Another weak point I find is that Mr. Johnston takes at face value what he has heard from ministers and the Prime Minister about what they knew, when they knew. And I think there's still more that needs to be done. I would have liked them to be sworn and to testify. You know, this would have forced them to tell the full truth. It's like if you are asking a bunch of kids who stole the cookie in the cookie jar, well, nobody will admit to that. There are things also, an important thing that I think should have been investigated more. It's all the disinformation activities conducted by the Chinese government, because it's the Chinese government that we are talking about, on WeChat, and this had, in my view, a real impact on the writings where the Chinese wanted the Liberal candidate to win. And the last point I would make is that when Mr. Johnston says that the Chinese don't have a preference for the Liberal or the Conservative, I can tell you that when I was ambassador, and shortly after the election held in the fall of 2015, officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs told me that they were very pleased with the election of Mr. Trudeau, and they summarized this by saying, red is good and blue is bad.
I wonder, Mr. MacKay, just jumping off of those points, if you would agree that the political vulnerability in all of this lies essentially with the idea that even removing the optics of Mr. Johnston's appointment, just the fact that one individual essentially came to these conclusions, we don't see the work very much of how he got or he arrived at those conclusions, and everyone is expected to kind of trust them. Is that where the political vulnerability from where you sit still lies?
Well, I think there's a number of political vulnerabilities here, Vassy. And firstly, I should say I very, very much agree with what former Ambassador Saint-Jacques has said. And the vulnerability, to come to your question, is not only the Liberal government being the beneficiary of Chinese interference, but, of course, Unfortunately for Mr. Johnston, who you'll hear many people say this, I have enormous respect for. I've worked with him both inside and outside politics, but he is compromised. Perception, optically, however you want to describe it, his association with Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister personally, and his father, and the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, all of which puts him in an awkward place. I would say the same were he to be doing this for the Conservatives because of his appointment as Governor General by a Conservative government. There are many people in the country, retired and current sitting judges, who could fill this role for the purposes of a public inquiry or even for this limited work that he has done. The conclusions that he has given are not a pass. Let's be clear. There is still a lot of issues here that need to be delved into in a much deeper fashion, hence the need for a public or a judicial inquiry. The ambassador's point with respect to testimony under oath, subpoena powers, the public, yes, would be prohibited from seeing some of that testimony and information based on top secret classification, but there is no question that a public inquiry goes much further, and we have a litany of examples that we can point to where those public inquiries for broader public consumption had elements of secrecy and information, including one, I believe, by Mr. Justice Ikabuchi about security, national security. And all of this is against a backdrop of an increasing, pernicious and persistent effort by China to engage in economic espionage, electoral interference, and basically getting access to Canadian information, data, and ultimately resources is what they're after. And so there is a broader requirement, I would suggest, that goes well beyond this issue of the 2 elections where interference occurred. And again, I think that's more credence for a broader public inquiry.
Well, I wanted to ask about that because I think we have understandably, given all the politics involved here and all the political reaction being focused very domestically. But both of you have a lot of experience in dealing with China. Mr. St. Jacques, I'll start with you. What is your perception of how China views the decision arrived at this week by Mr. Johnston?
Well, they must obviously be pleased with some of the decision, because it gives the impression that we are dealing with a problem maybe that was less serious than anticipated. That in fact, in the case of the Chinese diplomat, Mr. Jia Wei, who was expelled, that in fact he to which extent did he really threaten? But at the same time, the report of Mr. Johnston confirms that there have been various attempts, including that the Chinese Consulate General in Toronto was instrumental in getting Mr. Han Dong as the candidate for the Liberals in the election. And maybe Mr. Han did not know, but the fact is that they intervened. And we know about all the disinformation on WeChat. And as Mr. McKay said, when you add this to everything else that we have known about the efforts by Chinese operatives to silence people in the Chinese community by threatening them, by harassing them, trying to limit debate on Canadian campuses, opening secret police station, trying to influence the Prime Minister through a donation to the Trudeau Foundation. All this put together shows you that there is a systematic, well-financed, and comprehensive effort by China to interfere in Canada, both in the political system and more largely. And this requires a much stronger reaction on the part of the government, similar to what, in fact, we saw in Australia. Australia is a good example that we should look at.
Australia, for example, Mr. McKay, has a foreign agents registry. The government is now promising one. They've just finished consultations. As someone who, occupied the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs, who did deal with China, obviously the relationship with China has evolved since then, pardon me. Your thoughts on, the press release that they sent out yesterday in reaction to this was paraphrased, look, this is confirming what we've long said. We don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. What does that tell you?
Well, the propaganda that comes out of China is honestly quite laughable at times. They very often accuse other countries of doing exactly what they're doing and what they're often caught red-handed at doing. And the Australian example, again, is a good one. They have been deeply involved in trying to protect themselves, their data, their people, their integrity of their electoral system, arguably longer than we have. We also are part of the Five Eyes community, and as you know, there's been recently a communique that expresses in no uncertain terms the need for the Five Eyes communities to work closer together to come up with more defensive mechanisms and greater ability to combat against, in particular, cyber attacks. But this goes beyond that. I mean, Ambassador St. Jacques has laid out the various ways, including the police stations, on-campus intimidations, bribes that were being offered in a sense where money was being gathered to support one candidate over another, intimidation, including MPs Michael Chong. We heard about an email that Katie Telford denied, or at least wouldn't answer the question about, in terms of Bob Soroya, another Conservative candidate who lost as a result of the cumulative efforts that appeared to be going on. And so all of this adds to the narrative, in addition to the partisan element, but I would suggest more importantly and more seriously, of the need to delve deeply into the means at which Canada, Communication Security Establishment, CSIS, RCMP, in conjunction with our allies, can combat foreign interference on many levels, whether it is economic, whether it is political, whether it is efforts to undermine, disseminate misinformation. All of these have a very, very detrimental impact on our country. And I think Canadians, Vassy, are feeling very uneasy with the decision yesterday to proceed in the fashion which Mr. Johnston has laid out. There appears to be, again, not accusatory, but there appears to be some sort of an effort to avoid accountability, to avoid making those really tough decisions to examine information and question the individuals, not just accept what a few people behind closed doors may have told them.